Okay, here's an interesting challenge question. Name at least one critical thinking idea or tool not mentioned in this unit's reading so far that you think everyone should know about and use more often. Describe the idea or tool, give an example of its application, and explain how it is important. You may do this for more than one idea or tool here, but only one is required to meet the challenge. And then I cite an example of modus tollens in the Mastering Logical Reasoning presentation. If Jesus taught that we don't have to keep kosher, then his first apostles would have taught that also. But the first apostles didn't teach that we have to keep kosher, as Paul attests. Therefore, Jesus did not teach that we don't have to keep kosher. The text says this is an example of modus tollens, but my question is, would it also be an example of an unsound argument, since there is the possibility that the first apostles knowingly taught doctrine that was antithetical to Jesus' original teachings? Dr. Carrier responds, that would be a different use of the example. Note that modus tollens only describes deductive syllogistic arguments. Thus, the argument being discussed there is only the argument that the conclusion follows if the premises are true. In other words, the premise, his first apostles would have taught us that too, is assumed to be true. We could also challenge the truth of that premise, but that would be focusing on a different aspect of the argument, not its modus tollens structure. I'm just using it to show that structure. Thus, in that case, the question is not whether what they were teaching was antithetical to what Jesus taught, because the argument is already conditional on their not having done so. But to take up a different line of inquiry, i.e., the soundness of the premises, we'd have to go to Bayesian. Assuming an equal prior, we make no prior assumptions. The evidence is that Paul started pushing for it, and when he did, Paul was unable to ever cite a pre-resurrection Jesus as his source, telling him it's okay to do it. The probability of that being the evidence on the converse premise, that being all of the first apostles went against Jesus when insisting on being kosher, is therefore very low, whereas the probability of that being the evidence on the premise that all the apostles were sticking to what Jesus taught them, and Paul is the one introducing it as a novel teaching, is essentially 100%. The differential likelihood thus rules out the premise his first apostles went against Jesus when insisting on being kosher as too improbable to credit. That said, this is well spotted generally. It is good critical thinking to question whether a premise assumed to be true could be, after all, false. The next step, once you've worked out in what ways it could be false, as in maybe they all went against Jesus once in a while and therefore did so in this case, or maybe they all went against Jesus on most things, is to work out whether its being false is probable. In the case of maybe they all went against Jesus once in a while and therefore did so in this case, is actually by definition improbable, since once in a while means they went with Jesus most of the time, which means for any randomly selected teaching, for example, keeping kosher, it is not probable they went against it, even if indeed they went against some of Jesus's teachings overall, and in the case of maybe they all went against Jesus on most things, it's on background knowledge and probable, since most immediate successors to a believed leader across history don't immediately turn against most of the things their leader said. That would in fact be very unusual behavior for human beings in comparable situations, and unusual is a synonym for improbable. This could be reversed with evidence that Jesus did teach what Paul was. For example, if Paul was citing things Jesus was reported to him to have said during his ministry, and the apostles did not have a good reply to that. Another use of this thinking is to challenge a degree of certainty. For example, if you think it is much less certain Jesus taught kosher adherence than someone's argument requires. But that wouldn't affect this example, since any conclusion that is more probable than not carries the argument through. Generally, this becomes a model argument. i.e., an argument over what is possible rather than what is probable. If someone says it is impossible the disciples were deviating from Jesus on kosher rules, you can rebut that by pointing to the fact that it is actually possible they were. But this doesn't resolve what's probable. If someone says it is probable the disciples were deviating from Jesus on kosher rules, this cannot be rebutted by merely pointing to the fact that it is actually possible they were. You need something that ups its probability beyond merely possible, and indeed ups it enough to tip it back into being improbable, or as probable as not, which is a state of not knowing what Jesus likely taught about this. Okay, as I said before, this course has quite a bit of Latin in it when we're talking about the philosophy, the logical fallacies, and the way you form a philosophical argument looks a lot like it looks like mathematical formulas. So in this question, I ask, what does the little tilde mean? And so if you've ever seen a philosophical formula written out, you'll see this little symbol here. And this is Carrier's response. This is ASCII for the not operator in formal logic. And it points me to a table under negation. The Unicode symbol is this, but not all computers or browsers or devices will render it correctly. Indeed, you might be looking at an empty box or a box with a Unicode number in it, if yours won't render Unicode. It's also not as easy to find on a keyboard. I don't even know if it has standard positions across all keyboards. Note the third option for representing not, e.g., exclamation point, capital P, has largely fallen into disuse because it too often gets confused with the factorial operator in mathematics, even though that would be a capital P followed by the exclamation point rather than the other way around. So that tilde in front of the P means not P or the negation of P. It also means the hypothesis is false. Any hypothesis is true other than P, etc. And in this case, P would be a proposition, not a mathematical term. This can be confused with P followed by parentheses as the probability operator. So P in parentheses P would be the probability that P is true, while P in parentheses tilde P would be the probability that P is not true. And you would never have not P parentheses P, as that would be a meaningless expression. So we'll look at some more. I learned that lowercase h is hypothesis, and tilde h would mean not that hypothesis, meaning some hypothesis other than that hypothesis, aka the condition of the hypothesis H being false. Full disclosure, I'm still getting the hang of writing in this manner, but it's a start. Note that not H is sometimes not itself a single hypothesis, but means all possible mutually exclusive hypotheses that entail H is false. Sometimes it is binary. For example, the darkness either happened or it didn't is binary. So not H is the darkness will not happen, and this only entails it's a made-up story, since there are no other known causal ways the story can come about if it didn't happen. But suppose we allowed the random quantum appearance of a story as a logical possibility. The story just randomly forms in someone's head because of a cosmic ray hitting the right electron in their brain at the right moment, and the person is caused to truly believe it happened. Then we can have three possible hypotheses. It happened, someone made it up, or a cosmic ray caused someone to spontaneously imagine and believe it happened. Then H would be it happened, and not H would be inclusive of someone made it up and a cosmic light ray caused someone to spontaneously imagine and believe it happened, such that P in parentheses not H must equal the sum of P in parentheses made up plus P in parentheses cosmic ray. but you needn't have to know what P in parentheses made up or P in parentheses cosmic ray are, just that whatever they must sum up to P in parentheses not hypothesis. So in this formula, the upright bar signifies conditional on, or if, or when, or given. Those all mean the same thing. So this means the probability that H is true when B is true, aka if B is true, conditional on B being true, given that B is true, aka simply given B. B plus E must sum all human knowledge. Nothing can be left out and have a sound argument follow. And all that demarcates B from E is that E is the specific evidence we think bears on whether H is true or false, and B is all other human knowledge. Technically, you can demarcate these in any way you want, as long as you do the math to match. But this is the usual way it's done in Bayesian reasoning, especially in historical reasoning, since all data is past and not new data. So the demarcation of E as new data and B as old data is not applicable, though all data in E becomes data in B after we iterate the equation. For example, all prior probabilities are the posterior probabilities of previous, usually hypothetical runs of the equation, where what is now B, say the science of human psychology, was once E back in the past when humans were determining what the science of human psychology actually tells us. But once it's done that, it falls into B in all future calculations of what's probable in the world, particularly about human behavior, like telling or believing stories. And there's much more like that in the course. If you're as unfamiliar with philosophy and writing these formulas out as I was, don't fear it. You're going to get, like I said before, you're going to get out of this course as much as you put into it. So, however deep you want to dive into this stuff, you're going to learn a lot. I asked a question regarding different types of reasoning. I'm sure you've heard of deductive reasoning. There's other types. So here's my response to a challenge question on different types of reasoning. I'm in a Reddit forum in which people share random photos of their room, their vehicle, their closet, etc. And everyone uses what they call abductive reasoning, like Sherlock Holmes, to make guesses on what that person does for a living, how much money they make, what part of the world they live in, etc. Are they using the term abductive reasoning correctly? And how is abductive reasoning different from adductive reasoning? Carrier's response: that's a good question. It can vary from context. And he points me to some reading material from Engineering and Design. Abductive reasoning determines plausible hypotheses, and adductive reasoning determines plausible solutions. In abductive reasoning, the major premise is evident, but the minor premise, and therefore the conclusion, are only probable, which is what Sherlock Holmes actually always does. I think in the books he incorrectly calls this deductive reasoning, so the modern joke is to correct him by emphasizing it's abductive, not deductive reasoning he's talking about. Induction is the inverse. The minor premise is evident, but the major premise and therefore the conclusion are only probable. And deduction is the converse. The minor and major premises are assumed given, and the conclusion therefore certain. In truth, deductive reasoning is always just conditional. If the major and the minor premises are true, then the conclusion is true, which actually describes induction and abduction too. So I suppose really the difference is with the induction and abduction, we admit this, whereas in deduction, we pretend not to notice. To see why I think this is actually important, proper deductive reasoning is actually pretty useless in most cases, and used to detriment far too often by not admitting it is almost never really proving anything. And here, Dr. Carrier points me to an article, Why Syllogisms Usually Suck, Free Will Edition. Really, the only productive use of deduction is at stage 2 of the scientific method. Abduction, coming up with a hypothesis. Deduction, determining what must be observed if the hypothesis is true, and conversely if it is false. Induction, making observations and seeing which deduced pattern it fits better to arrive at a probability that the tested hypothesis is true. Note that stage 2 does not alone prove anything. You cannot determine from deduction whether a hypothesis is true or false. It just helps you figure out how to do that. The only other useful role for deduction is in formal proofs, which mostly only have application in mathematics. And at some point in this course, I'm hoping it applied to what we were talking about, but I told a dumb joke. God is love, love is blind, Ray Charles is blind, therefore Ray Charles is God. And I asked Dr. Carrier, would this be an example of equivocation or a verbal ambiguity? And Richard's response is as follows. This would count as an equivocation in a particular form called amphiboly, since the equivocation is grammatical rather than in the vocabulary. The verb is being used differently. As Clinton would say, that depends on what your definition of is, in which his case was a valid, albeit sneaky point about chronology. For example, is does not mean the same thing as was, and really it was Clinton playing at amphiboly there, since he answered under oath, there is nothing going on between us, which of course there was something going on between them, past tense. In law, that is not a valid excuse, though, since it is still perjury if you don't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And obfuscating with the tense of a verb is evading the telling of the whole truth. So, God is identical to love does not grammatically mean the same thing as Ray Charles is identical to blindness. In the second case, is refers to a state of being. Ray Charles is in the state of being blind as a subordinate property of Ray Charles. But that won't work for the first premise. God is in a state of being loving is simply not what God is love can grammatically be signifying. And in the middle premise, love is blind, the word is signifies yet another different relation, one of metaphorical capability. People who are in love often act as if metaphorically blind, which is not the same kind of blindness, nor the same kind of being in a state of. So grammatically, the argument is a mess. And when that happens, what you have is an amphiboly. Other examples are the declaration, fruit flies like a banana, and the headline, prostitutes appeal to Pope. It becomes a fallacy of amphiboly when the ambiguity is exploited in an argument like fruit flies like a banana, therefore pineapples have the same aerodynamic properties as bananas, or prostitutes appeal to Pope, therefore the Pope is into prostitutes.